All right, let's talk about the Somali community corruption case, and more importantly, what it actually means beyond the headlines. Because if you've been following the coverage, you've probably noticed something interesting. On the surface, this looks like a local corruption story, a community-based program, public funds, allegations of fraud, investigations, court documents. Nothing America hasn't seen before. But the reaction to this case tells us something deeper is happening. This isn't just about one community. It's not even just about corruption. This case has become a pressure point, a moment where multiple political, cultural, and institutional tensions are colliding all at once. And if we're being honest, the long-term consequences are likely to be much bigger than most people realize right now. So today, I want to step back and look at this the way an American political analyst would, not emotionally, not ideologically, but structurally. What changes because of this case? What doors does it open? What assumptions does it challenge? And how is it likely to be used, not just by politicians, but by institutions? Let's start with the most obvious question people are asking. Yes, this case will almost certainly be used to justify tighter immigration and refugee policies. But probably not in the way a lot of people expect. What you're unlikely to hear is a blunt argument that says, this happened because of Somali immigrants, or this is why we shouldn't accept refugees. That kind of language doesn't survive the American legal system, and it doesn't play well with swing voters either. Instead, what you're going to hear, and what you're already hearing, is a different frame. You'll hear phrases like systemic abuse, oversight failure, lack of accountability, and taxpayer-funded programs without proper safeguards. The focus will be on systems, not identities. And from a political standpoint, that's a much smarter move because once the conversation shifts from who people are to how programs are run, it becomes much easier to argue for policy changes without triggering immediate moral backlash. So what does that mean in practice? It means refugee and humanitarian admission programs are likely to face longer vetting processes, stricter financial oversight, and more centralized monitoring. Not because of ideology, but because this case provides a concrete example that policymakers can point to and say, look, this isn't theoretical. This already happened. It also means welfare access tied to immigration status is likely to be re-examined, not eliminated, but narrowed, conditioned, and more aggressively audited. And perhaps most importantly, it means local governments that administer these programs will be under pressure. Because one of the quiet lessons of this case is that federal money often flows through local systems that are politically reluctant to ask hard questions. Which brings us to the second big theme people are talking about: conservatism. Yes, this case does strengthen conservative influence in the U.S. political conversation, but not in the way cable news often frames it. This isn't about America suddenly turning right. Demographics haven't changed overnight. Urban politics haven't flipped. Young voters haven't suddenly embraced hardline conservatism. What has changed is the center of gravity. Topics that were previously considered politically dangerous to discuss, especially around immigration, welfare programs, and community governance, are now harder to dismiss as off-limits. And when there are court filings, audit trails, and dollar amounts involved, it becomes much harder to shut down discussion by appealing solely to moral language. And that's where conservative ideas gain traction, not because they dominate, but because the conversation itself shifts closer to their long-standing arguments about responsibility, enforcement, and accountability. That matters because in American politics, winning isn't always about convincing the extremes. It's about nudging the middle. Now, here's where things start getting more interesting and more complicated. Because beyond immigration policy and ideological influence, this case has ripple effects that go much deeper into how the system actually works. The first of those ripple effects is what I'd call a spillover scrutiny effect. Once a corruption case like this becomes visible, auditors don't stop at one community. They start asking whether similar structures exist elsewhere. Are there other programs with similar funding models, similar reporting requirements, similar oversight gaps. And when that happens, scrutiny expands horizontally, across communities, across nonprofits, across jurisdictions. This doesn't mean everyone is doing something wrong, but it does mean compliance costs go up, reporting becomes stricter, and organizations that relied on informal trust relationships with government agencies suddenly find themselves under formal review, which leads directly to the second effect: changes in local political behavior. Local officials, city council members, school board leaders, agency directors tend to be highly risk-averse. For years, many of them avoided close scrutiny of minority-focused programs out of fear of being accused of discrimination or insensitivity. This case changes that calculation, because now, failing to ask questions carries its own political risk. Silence can be framed as negligence, inaction can be framed as complicity. So what you're likely to see is a shift toward more documentation, more public reporting, and fewer behind-the-scenes accommodations. That doesn't make local politics more compassionate, it makes it more bureaucratic, and that has consequences. One of those consequences is a reduction in the informal power of community leaders. For a long time, many community organizations operated on moral authority. They were seen as representatives of vulnerable populations, and their claims were often taken at face value. After a corruption scandal, that changes. Governments start looking for alternative interlocutors, technocrats, compliance officers, external consultants, people who speak the language of audits rather than advocacy. This doesn't eliminate community leadership, but it shifts what kind of leadership is rewarded. Which brings us to another under-discussed consequence: the restructuring of the nonprofit ecosystem. Cases like this undermine what you might call the trust premium that nonprofits traditionally enjoy. In the past, being labeled a nonprofit often meant lighter oversight and greater discretion. That's increasingly no longer the case. Governments respond to scandals by demanding measurable outcomes, standardized reporting, and frequent financial disclosures. Large, national nonprofits can absorb those costs. Small, grassroots organizations often can't. So ironically, efforts to prevent corruption can end up concentrating power in larger institutions while squeezing out smaller, community-based groups. That's not a conservative or liberal outcome. It's a structural one, and it raises uncomfortable questions about whether the people closest to communities are actually being empowered or gradually replaced. Another area where the impact is subtle but significant is media framing. You may have noticed that coverage of these cases increasingly avoids emotional language and leans into procedural vocabulary: audits, indictments, oversight failures, compliance reviews. That's not accidental. Media institutions are responding to audience fatigue with moralized narratives. They're also responding to legal risk. The result is a slow shift away from identity-based framing toward governance-based framing. That's important because it changes how future stories are told. Instead of asking, "Who is being targeted?" journalists are more likely to ask, "How did the system allow this?" And that reframing opens space for policy discussions that were previously hard to have. But perhaps the most complex impact is inside immigrant communities themselves. Corruption scandals don't just damage external reputation, they fracture internal trust. Ordinary residents start asking whether funds meant for them were diverted. Younger members question older leadership. Reform-minded voices clash with defensive ones. Some people demand transparency, others fear stigma, and that tension doesn't disappear quickly. Communities often respond by becoming more guarded, more cautious in their public messaging, and more sensitive to outside scrutiny. Again, this isn't about guilt or innocence. It's about human behavior under pressure. Finally, there's an international dimension that rarely gets discussed. The United States has long promoted its refugee and humanitarian systems as models for other countries. When high-profile corruption cases emerge, that narrative weakens. Other governments become more cautious. International organizations reference U.S. failures alongside its successes. Humanitarian migration increasingly gets framed not just as a moral issue, but as a governance challenge. And that reframing has global implications. So when you put all of this together, what do you see? You see a case that is being used to justify tighter controls. Yes. You see conservative ideas gaining traction. Yes. But more than that, you see a system recalibrating itself. Trust is being replaced by verification. Moral authority is being replaced by procedural accountability, and political sensitivity is being replaced by institutional caution. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing depends on your values. But pretending it isn't happening would be a mistake. The Somali community corruption case isn't just a story about wrongdoing. It's a story about how modern democracies respond when ideals collide with implementation. And the effects of that response will be felt long after the headlines move on. That's what really matters here. Thanks for watching.